The small dusty bar on the outskirts of Tumbleweed County rarely saw much excitement. Most evenings, the same weathered faces gathered around worn wooden tables, sharing stories that everyone had heard 100 times before. But on this particular Friday night, the atmosphere shifted when the door swung open and a slender woman in worn boots, faded jeans, and a wide-brimmed hat stepped inside. She moved with quiet confidence, her eyes scanning the room before settling on an empty stool at the far end of the bar. The bartender, a heavy-set man in his 60s called Joe, nodded in recognition as she approached. "Evening, Rose," he said, already reaching for a bottle of whiskey. "The usual?" Rose nodded, her expression revealing nothing as she took her seat. At first glance, she looked like any other ranch hand or horse trainer from the area, calloused hands, sun-kissed skin, and a no-nonsense demeanor that discouraged unnecessary conversation. Most locals knew better than to bother her, but the group of bikers who'd rolled into town earlier that day weren't locals. There were 5 of them, leather-clad and loud, celebrating something with rounds of shots and boisterous laughter. Their massive motorcycles gleamed outside in the parking lot, a stark contrast to the dusty pickup trucks that usually occupied the space. They'd been passing through on their way to a rally in Nevada when they decided to stop for the night. The tallest of the group, a bearded man with arms covered in faded tattoos who went by the nickname Bear, noticed Rose first. He nudged his companions and grinned. "Look at little Miss Cowgirl over there," he said, just loud enough for her to hear. All alone on a Friday night. Rose didn't react, simply sipped her whiskey and kept her eyes forward. Her apparent disinterest only seemed to encourage Bear, who pushed away from his table and approached the bar, positioning himself right next to her. "Let me buy you a real drink, darlin'," he said, leaning in closer than necessary. "Then maybe you can show me what country girls do for fun around here." The bartender tensed, his hand moving beneath the counter, but Rose gave him a subtle shake of her head. She turned slowly to face Bear, her expression neutral. "I appreciate the offer," she said evenly, "but I'm just here for a quiet drink." Bear's smile faltered slightly, but he pressed on. "Come on now, don't be like that. My friends and I are just looking for a good time." By now, the other bikers had gathered behind their leader, creating a half-circle that effectively cornered Rose against the bar. The other patrons watched nervously, some slipping out the door rather than risk getting involved in whatever was about to happen. "Your friends seem nice," Rose commented, her tone conversational as she scanned the group. Her eyes lingered briefly on a shorter man hanging toward the back of the group. He had a nervous energy about him, his eyes darting around the room. "Especially your buddy there. What's your name, friend?" The shorter man froze, surprise crossing his face before he quickly recovered. "They call me Wrench," he muttered, clearly uncomfortable with her attention. A hint of a smile crossed Rose's face. "Wrench, that's interesting. Would that be the same Wrench who skipped bail in Arizona last month? Assault and battery charges, if I remember correctly." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Wrench's face drained of color, while confusion spread across the faces of his companions. "What the hell is she talking about?" one of the other bikers demanded. Rose took another sip of her whiskey before setting it down and turning to fully face the group. "Your friend here is running from the law," she explained calmly. "And I'm afraid your little detour to this bar wasn't as random as you might have thought. See, I've been tracking him for about 2 weeks now." Understanding dawned slowly on Bear's face. "You're a cop?" he asked incredulously. "Bounty hunter," Rose corrected, reaching slowly into her jacket. Instead of a weapon, she pulled out a folded document with an official seal. "And I've got paperwork that says Mr. Wrench here needs to come with me back to Arizona to face his charges." For a moment, nobody moved. Then Wrench broke the silence with a string of curses and lunged toward the door. He didn't make it 3 steps before Rose was out of her seat, moving with surprising speed for someone who'd appeared so relaxed moments before. Her boot caught him behind the knee, sending him crashing to the floor. "I wouldn't," she advised the other bikers, who looked ready to jump in. From beneath her jacket, she produced a small but official-looking badge and, more convincingly, a compact pistol that appeared in her hand as if by magic. "This doesn't concern any of you. Your friend made his choices." Bear raised his hand slightly, eyes darting between Rose and his fallen companion. "Look, we don't want any trouble. We didn't know Wrench was running from anything. He just joined our group a couple weeks ago." 3 weeks ago, Rose corrected. "Right after he jumped bail." She kept her attention split between Wrench on the floor and the other bikers, never letting her guard down. "Here's what's going to happen. I'm taking him in, collecting my fee, and you all can continue on your way to Nevada without any complications." The oldest member of the biker group, a gray-haired man with a weathered face who hadn't spoken until now, stepped forward cautiously. "Bear, she's right. This isn't our fight. Wrench lied to all of us." Bear hesitated, clearly torn between loyalty to a riding companion and the reality of the situation. Finally, he nodded and stepped back. "He's all yours, Cowgirl." Rose worked quickly, securing Wrench's hands behind his back with zip ties she produced from her pocket. As she hauled him to his feet, the bar door opened again, and a tall, broad-shouldered man in a sheriff's uniform entered. "Everything under control, Rose?" he asked, taking in the scene with practiced eyes. "Just fine, Sheriff Taylor," she replied. "Just making a collection. These gentlemen were just leaving, I believe." The sheriff nodded to the bikers. "I'd suggest moving along. Your rooms at the motel are still available if you want them, but I think your stay in our town is about done, don't you?" With reluctant nods, the bikers filed out of the bar, the excitement of their night thoroughly dampened. As Rose handed Wrench over to the sheriff, the bartender approached with a small smile. "You know, Rose, one of these days you're going to get yourself killed pulling stunts like that," he said, refilling her abandoned glass. "Why didn't you just wait for Taylor to get here?" Rose shrugged, returning to her stool and her drink. "And miss all the fun? Besides, I've been tracking this one for too long to risk him slipping away." She took a satisfied sip. $10,000 bounty. Not bad for a night's work. The sheriff returned a few minutes later, having secured Wrench in his cruiser. "I'll hold him for you until morning," he told Rose. "Arizona authorities are sending someone to meet you at the state line tomorrow." He hesitated, then added, "That was reckless, Rose. 5 against 1 aren't odds even you should be playing with." Rose smiled, the first genuine smile she'd shown all evening. "Who said I was playing? Besides, most of them were just followers. Only Wrench was desperate, and desperate men make mistakes." She raised her glass in a mock toast. "To another successful hunt." As the sheriff left, the remaining patrons in the bar regarded Rose with a mixture of awe and wariness. To most of them, she was just the quiet woman who occasionally helped train horses at the Thompson Ranch outside of town. Few knew about her other life, tracking down fugitives across the Southwest. Joe leaned across the bar. "You gonna stick around town for a while this time?" he asked. Rose considered the question as she finished her drink. "Maybe a few days. Got a lead on another skip-up in Montana I might follow up on." She stood, leaving cash on the counter. "But first, I need some sleep. It's been a long couple of weeks." As she walked toward the door, a young woman who'd been watching from a corner table hurried to intercept her. "Excuse me," she said hesitantly. I couldn't help overhearing. You're really a bounty hunter?" Rose studied the woman, barely more than a girl really, with nervous eyes and a fading bruise partially concealed by makeup on her cheekbone. "That's right," Rose answered cautiously. I think I need your help," the young woman whispered, glancing over her shoulder as if afraid someone might be watching. My ex-boyfriend, he's supposed to be in jail, but he's not, and he's been leaving messages saying he's coming for me. Something in Rose's expression softened slightly. What's your name? Beth, the young woman replied. Well, Beth, Rose said, holding the door open, walk with me to my truck. Tell me everything about this ex-boyfriend of yours, starting with his name and why he was supposed to be in jail. As they stepped out into the cool night air, Beth began to talk, and Rose listened carefully. Another hunt was beginning, and this one felt personal already. Some men needed to learn that their actions had consequences, and Rose was more than happy to be the one delivering that lesson. The small town of Tumbleweed County had no idea that the quiet woman in cowboy boots who occasionally passed through was one of the most successful bounty hunters in the Southwest. And Rose preferred to keep it that way. After all, surprise was one of her most effective weapons. The morning sun cast long shadows across Rose's small cabin on the edge of town. It wasn't much, just a one-bedroom rental with sparse furniture and practical amenities, but it served its purpose as a temporary base between hunts. Rose sat at her kitchen table, a laptop open in front of her, a mug of black coffee cooling beside it. Dwayne Miller, she muttered, studying the man's mugshot on the screen. 3 priors for domestic violence, violated restraining orders twice, and now jumped bail on an aggravated assault charge. After listening to Beth's story the previous night, Rose had driven the young woman to a friend's house where she'd be safe, then spent several hours researching Beth's ex-boyfriend. What she discovered reinforced her decision to take the case, despite the relatively small bail amount. The sound of tires on gravel announced Sheriff Taylor's arrival. Rose closed her laptop and went to the door. Morning, he said, removing his hat as he stepped inside. Got your paperwork for the Arizona pickup. He handed her an envelope. They're sending someone to meet you at noon. Rose nodded, accepting the documents. Thanks for holding him overnight. No problem. Taylor hesitated, then added, heard you met Beth Collins last night. Word travels fast, Rose commented, not particularly surprised. Small town, Taylor shrugged. You looking into her situation with Miller? Might be, Rose admitted, pouring a second cup of coffee and sliding it across the counter to him. You know something about it? Taylor took the coffee gratefully. Miller's bad news. Did time for putting his last girlfriend in the hospital, got out early on good behavior. Started dating Beth about a year ago. Same pattern started all over. He sighed heavily. She finally pressed charges after he broke her wrist, but his family's got money. Posted bail and disappeared. Local bail bondsman? Yep. Frank Peterson. He's been looking for Miller too, doesn't want to lose his money. Rose considered this. I'll stop by his office after I make the Arizona drop. You sure you want to get involved? Taylor asked. Miller's not just some petty criminal or bail jumper. He's dangerous, especially to women. All the more reason someone should find him, Rose replied evenly. Besides, I'm between major jobs at the moment. Taylor knew her well enough to recognize the determination in her voice. All right then. Just be careful. He finished his coffee and set the mug down. By the way, those bikers left town last night. Didn't even stay at the motel. Good, Rose said. One less thing to worry about. After the sheriff left, Rose packed a small bag for her trip to the Arizona border. 6 hours of driving round trip, then she could focus on finding Dwayne Miller. The bounty wouldn't be much, perhaps $2,000 given the bail amount, but this wasn't about money. Rose had seen too many men like Miller walk free, too many women like Beth left living in fear. Sometimes, justice needed a helping hand. As she loaded her truck, Rose's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Heard you're looking for Dwayne. I might know something. Meet at Carter's Diner when you're back in town. Frank P. The bail bondsman was reaching out. Interesting. Rose sent a quick acknowledgement, then slid behind the wheel. First, she had a fugitive to deliver. Then the real hunt would begin. What Rose didn't notice was the mud-spattered motorcycle partially hidden among the trees across from her cabin, or the figure watching her departure through binoculars. Someone had followed her home last night, someone who had unfinished business with the Cowgirl bounty hunter. The Arizona handoff went smoothly. Rose collected her bounty and was back in Tumbleweed County by late afternoon, the envelope of cash tucked securely in her jacket pocket. She pulled into the gravel lot of Carter's Diner, a roadside establishment known for its pie and discretion. The perfect place for conversations that shouldn't be overheard. Frank Peterson sat in a corner booth, a half-eaten slice of apple pie in front of him. In his 50s with a receding hairline and sharp eyes, he'd been in the bail bonds business long enough to recognize trouble when he saw it. He nodded as Rose slid into the seat across from him. "Appreciate you meeting me," he said, pushing aside his plate. "Word is you've got quite the reputation for finding people who don't want to be found." "I get by," Rose replied simply. "You mentioned Dwayne Miller?" Frank nodded, glancing around before leaning forward. "I put up $15,000 for his bail. If I don't find him, that's coming out of my pocket. Why not use your regular recovery agents?" "Tried that. Miller's smarter than he looks. 2 of my guys tracked him to a motel in Benson County last week, but he spotted them and disappeared again." Frank sighed. "I need someone he won't recognize, someone different." Rose understood his meaning. A woman might get closer to Miller without raising his suspicions. "What can you tell me that's not in the official reports?" she asked. Frank reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded paper. "Miller's got a cousin who owns a hunting cabin about 50 miles north of here. Remote place, no neighbors." He slid the paper to Rose. "Address and directions. My guys checked it last week but found nothing. Thing is, I got a call from the general store owner nearby yesterday. Said someone matching Miller's description bought supplies, enough for a week or more." Rose studied the directions. "He might be moving between locations. That's my guess. There's also this." Frank pulled out his phone and showed her a social media post. "His sister posted this yesterday. Looks innocent enough, talking about family dinner, but look at the background." Rose examined the photo, noting the distinctive wood paneling. "Same as the cabin?" "Exactly. I think she's visited him there. She took the post down an hour later, but not before I saw it." Rose nodded, committing the details to memory. "Any weapons I should know about?" "He's a hunter. Registered for several firearms, rifles mainly, maybe a handgun." Frank hesitated. "There's something else. Miller's got a temper, but he's not stupid. When he jumped bail, he cleared out his bank accounts. Almost $40,000. He could be planning to leave the state, maybe the country. All the more reason to find him quickly," Rose said. Frank slid an envelope across the table. "Half my finder's fee up front. Rest when you bring him in." Rose left it on the table. "I'll find him because he needs to face justice. Keep your money until the job's done." As Rose stood to leave, Frank added, "Be careful. His last girlfriend before Beth? She wasn't just hospitalized. Doctor said another few minutes and she wouldn't have made it. Miller's escalating." With a nod of understanding, Rose headed for the door. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. She'd need to prepare before heading to the cabin, gather supplies, check her gear. So focused was she on planning her next move that she failed to notice the same mud-spattered motorcycle parked across the street, or the bearded figure in black leather who watched her through the diner window, a look of cold determination on his face. Bear hadn't forgotten the humiliation of the previous night, and he had plans of his own for the bounty hunter. Dawn was just breaking when Rose finished her preparations. Her truck was packed with everything she might need: basic surveillance equipment, restraints, first aid supplies, and her licensed firearms securely locked in their cases. She'd spent half the night researching the area around the hunting cabin, memorizing access roads and potential escape routes. Before leaving, she made 2 calls. The first to Sheriff Taylor, letting him know her destination and plans, a safety measure she'd learned early in her career. The second call was to Beth, checking that she was still safe at her friend's house. "Has he tried to contact you again?" Rose asked. 3 more messages last night. Beth's voice was shaky. "He says he misses me, that he's changed, then threatens what he'll do when he finds me." Classic Dwayne. "Stay where you are," Rose advised. "Don't respond to any messages. I'm following a lead today." After hanging up, Rose took one final look around her cabin. Something felt off, but she couldn't place what. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, an instinct that had saved her life more than once. Carefully, she moved to the window and scanned the tree line, looking for anything unusual. Nothing obvious, but the feeling persisted. Someone had been watching her place, she was sure of it. Rose adjusted her plans, taking a different route out of town than she normally would, frequently checking her rearview mirror for signs of pursuit. The hunting cabin was nestled in dense woodland about 2 hours north. Rose parked her truck half a mile away, concealing it among the trees, and continued on foot. The morning air was crisp, birds calling to each other overhead as she moved silently through the underbrush, years of tracking experience evident in her careful movements. After 20 minutes, she caught her first glimpse of the cabin, a rustic, single-story structure with a small porch and tin roof. Smoke curled from the chimney, confirming someone was inside. To the left of the cabin sat a mud-splattered pickup truck. Miller's vehicle had been described in the police report as a blue Ford, and this matched the description. Rose settled into a concealed position with a clear view of the cabin and prepared to wait. Patience was essential in her line of work. She needed to confirm Miller was alone before making a move. An hour passed before the cabin door opened. A man stepped onto the porch, stretching in the morning sun. Even from this distance, Rose recognized him from the mugshots, Dwayne Miller. He looked more ragged than in his photos, with a scruffy beard and unwashed hair, but it was definitely him. She watched as he walked to his truck, retrieved something from the passenger seat, and returned to the cabin. The brief glimpse was enough to spot the holstered handgun at his waist. Frank had been right about the weapons. Rose weighed her options. She could call for backup, but the nearest sheriff's deputy was at least 30 minutes away. Miller could disappear again in that time. She could wait until nightfall, but that carried its own risks. As she considered her approach, a sound behind her froze her in place, the unmistakable snap of a twig under a heavy boot. Someone else was in these woods, and they were close. Rose slowly reached for her sidearm, keeping her movements minimal. Had Miller posted a lookout? Or was it something else entirely? The back of her neck prickled again with that same warning sensation from earlier. She wasn't the only hunter in these woods today. The question was, who was hunting whom? Rose remained perfectly still, controlling her breathing as she listened intently. Another snap, closer this time. Whoever was approaching wasn't making much effort to conceal their movements. Either an amateur or someone who didn't care about being detected. She carefully shifted position, moving behind a large pine tree for better cover while maintaining her view of the cabin. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the rustle of undergrowth. Rose tightened her grip on her sidearm, ready but hoping she wouldn't need it. A figure emerged into a small clearing about 30 feet from her position. Rose's eyes narrowed as she recognized the bearded man in the leather jacket. Bear. The biker from the bar. He was alone and moving with purpose, his gaze scanning the woods. Looking for her. This complicated things. Rose now had two problems: Miller in the cabin and an angry biker with a grudge prowling the woods. She needed to deal with Bear before he compromised her position or, worse, alerted Miller. As if on cue, the cabin door opened again. Miller stepped out, this time with a rifle slung over his shoulder. He called out to someone inside, his words inaudible at this distance, then headed toward the tree line, directly toward where Bear was moving. Rose had seconds to make a decision. If the two men encountered each other, her element of surprise would be lost. Worse, if Bear mentioned a woman bounty hunter to Miller, her cover would be blown completely. Moving swiftly and silently, Rose circled around to intercept Bear before he could get any closer to the cabin. She closed the distance quickly, years of tracking experience evident in her silent approach. Bear never heard her coming. Rose emerged from behind him, pressing her sidearm against his back. "Not another step," she whispered. "Not another sound." The biker tensed but had enough sense not to shout. Well. If it isn't the cowgirl," he whispered back, a hint of a smile in his voice despite the gun at his back. "Hands where I can see them," Rose ordered quietly. Slowly. Bear complied, raising his hands. "Followed you from town. Wasn't hard. You should be more careful." "What do you want?" Rose demanded, keeping her voice low, ears still attuned to Miller's movements in the distance. "Figured you owed me after embarrassing me and my boys," Bear replied. "Thought I'd return the favor, maybe mess up whatever job you're working on." "Bad timing," Rose said. "There's a dangerous man in that cabin who won't hesitate to shoot both of us if he spots us." Bear chuckled softly. "So the hunter becomes the hunted." Poetic. A twig snapped loudly to their right. Both Rose and Bear froze. Miller had changed direction and was now heading straight for their position, rifle in hand. "Down," Rose hissed, pushing Bear to the ground and dropping beside him behind a fallen log. Miller emerged into view just 30 feet away, scanning the woods carefully. He'd clearly heard something. "Who's out there?" he called, raising his rifle to his shoulder. "This is private property." Rose and Bear lay motionless, barely breathing. Miller took another step forward, eyes narrowed with suspicion. "I know someone's there," he continued. "Show yourself or I start shooting." Rose glanced at Bear, who was watching her with unexpected intensity. Their dispute suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the armed fugitive preparing to open fire. "We need to work together," she whispered, barely audible. "Or neither of us walks out of these woods." Bear hesitated, then gave a slight nod. "What's the play, cowgirl?" Before Rose could answer, Miller fired a warning shot into the air. "Last chance," he shouted. Time had run out. They needed to act now. Rose's mind raced through options. Direct confrontation with Miller was too dangerous given his position and readiness to fire. Running would only draw his aim. They needed a distraction. "I need you to circle around left," she whispered to Bear. "Create noise, but stay hidden. Draw his attention away from here." Bear looked skeptical. "And leave you with a clear shot at him? How do I know you won't just take care of both problems at once?" "Because I don't shoot people in the back," Rose replied. "And right now, he's the bigger threat to both of us." Another moment of tension passed between them before Bear nodded. "Fine. But this doesn't end our business." "Wouldn't expect it to," Rose said. "Go on my signal." She reached down, grabbed a rock, and nodded to Bear. As he began crawling away through the undergrowth, Rose threw the rock far to the right. It crashed through branches, creating noise that immediately caught Miller's attention. "I see you," Miller shouted, swinging his rifle toward the sound and firing a shot that splintered bark from a tree. Bear used the distraction to move quickly to the left, deliberately creating rustling sounds as he went. The strategy worked. Miller turned toward the new noise, confusion evident on his face as he tried to track multiple targets. "Who's out there?" he demanded, voice rising with anger and fear. "Show yourselves." Rose seized the moment of confusion to change her own position, moving to a spot with better cover and a clearer line of sight to Miller. The man was now caught between her and Bear, his head swiveling back and forth as sounds came from multiple directions. Then Bear took it a step further than Rose had anticipated. He let out a loud whistle from deep in the woods to her left, followed by a call, "Over here. I found something." Miller spun toward the voice, firing another shot in Bear's direction. "Federal marshals," he shouted, panic now evident in his voice. "You won't take me." Rose realized Bear's improvisation had given Miller a critical piece of misinformation. He now believed he was surrounded by law enforcement, not a bounty hunter and a vengeful biker. It was an advantage they hadn't planned for but could use. "Dwayne Miller," she called out in her most authoritative voice. "Drop your weapon. The cabin is surrounded." Miller's face contorted with rage and fear. Instead of complying, he turned and ran back toward the cabin, firing another wild shot over his shoulder as he went. Rose emerged from cover, weapon raised. "Drop it, Miller. Last warning." But Miller was beyond reasoning. He reached the cabin porch and kicked the door open, disappearing inside. Bear appeared from the trees to Rose's left, breathing heavily. "Well, that could have gone better," he remarked dryly. "He's cornered himself," Rose said, eyes fixed on the cabin. "This actually works in our favor. Except now he's barricaded with who knows how many weapons," Bear pointed out. Rose nodded, acknowledging the complication. There might be another problem too. When he went out earlier, he called to someone inside. "You think he's got company?" "Could be." Rose pulled out her phone, checking for signal. "One bar, barely enough. I need to call this in. Sheriff Taylor needs to know what's happening." As she dialed, a woman's scream came from inside the cabin, followed by the sound of something breaking. Rose and Bear exchanged glances. The situation had just become exponentially more dangerous. Someone else was in that cabin with Miller, and they were in trouble. "Change of plans," Rose said, holstering her phone. "We can't wait for backup." Rose quickly assessed the situation, her experienced eyes scanning the cabin for entry points. 2 windows on the side, the front door, likely a back entrance as well. The woman's scream had changed everything. This was no longer just about capturing a fugitive. "I need to know if you're actually with me on this," she said to Bear, her tone deadly serious. "What happens between us can wait. Right now, there's someone in there who needs help." Bear studied her face, seeming to gauge her sincerity. After a moment, he nodded. "What's the play?" "We need eyes inside before we move," Rose replied. "I'll circle around back. You stay here, keep watch on the front. If he comes out, don't engage unless absolutely necessary." "Got it," Bear agreed, surprising Rose with his quick cooperation. "But if things go south, I'm coming in." Rose moved quickly through the trees, keeping low and using the cabin's blind spots to approach the rear. As she'd suspected, there was a back door leading to what appeared to be a kitchen. Through a small window, she caught glimpses of movement, Miller pacing, gesturing angrily, a rifle still in his hands. Then she saw the other person, a young woman, perhaps in her 20s, sitting at a small table. Her wrists were bound with duct tape, her face tear-streaked and frightened. Not Beth, Rose realized with a mixture of relief and concern. Someone else. The sister who had visited, perhaps? Rose circled back to Bear, staying low. Woman inside, tied up. Looks like a hostage situation now. Hostage? Bear whispered, his expression hardening. That wasn't part of the deal. It changes things, Rose agreed. I can't wait for backup. Every minute increases the risk. She paused, making a decision. I need your help. For real this time. To her surprise, Bear's demeanor shifted. The vengeful biker was gone, replaced by something more serious, more focused. I've got a sister about that age, he said simply. What do you need me to do? Rose quickly outlined her plan. It was risky, but with the right timing, it could work. Bear would create a distraction at the front while Rose entered through the back. Their priority was the woman's safety, then subduing Miller. If you get shot playing hero, don't blame me, Bear muttered, but there was no real bite to his words. Worried about me, Bear? Rose asked with the ghost of a smile. Worried about missing the chance to settle our score myself, he retorted, but there was something different in his eyes now, a reluctant respect. They synchronized watches and moved into position. Rose crouched by the back door, listening intently. Inside, Miller's voice rose and fell, angry demands interspersed with pleas. They'll never let me explain, Katie. You have to help me get across the border. Your car, your ID, they won't look for a woman. The woman, Katie, sobbed something inaudible. Miller's voice hardened again. Don't make me hurt you. Family or not, I'll do what I have to. Rose checked her watch. 10 seconds until Bear's distraction. She readied herself, focusing her breathing, clearing her mind of everything except the next few critical moments. On cue, a tremendous crash came from the front of the cabin, followed by Bear's voice booming, "Police! Come out with your hands up!" Miller shouted in alarm. Rose heard his footsteps pounding toward the front of the cabin, followed by a single gunshot. Her heart lurched. Had Bear been hit? No time to worry about that now. Rose moved swiftly, testing the back door. Unlocked. She eased it open and slipped inside, finding herself in a small kitchen. Just beyond, Katie sat alone at the table, eyes wide with terror. Rose pressed a finger to her lips, moving silently toward the bound woman. Rose reached Katie in 3 swift strides, pulling a small knife from her boot. The woman flinched away until Rose whispered, "I'm here to help." Stay quiet. Relief flooded Katie's tear-streaked face as Rose carefully cut through the duct tape binding her wrists. From the front of the cabin came sounds of struggle, crashes, shouts, the thud of something heavy hitting the floor. "My brother," Katie whispered urgently. "He's not well. He needs help, not prison." "First, we need to get you safe," Rose countered, helping Katie to her feet. "Can you walk?" Before Katie could answer, the kitchen door burst open. Miller stood in the doorway, wild-eyed, a trickle of blood running from his temple. His rifle was gone, but he held a hunting knife that gleamed dangerously in the dim light. "Get away from her," he snarled at Rose, his knuckles white around the knife handle. Rose pushed Katie behind her, facing Miller with steady calm. "It's over, Dwayne. Put the knife down." "Nothing's over," Miller spat, his eyes darting between Rose and his sister. "Katie, come here. Now." "Dwayne, please," Katie pleaded. "This has to stop. Think about what you did to Beth, what you're doing now." Miller's face contorted with rage. "Shut up. You don't understand. She deserved it, they all did." He lunged forward, knife extended. Rose reacted instantly, sidestepping the attack and using his momentum to send him crashing into the kitchen table. The knife clattered to the floor, sliding under the refrigerator. Miller recovered quickly, spinning around with fists raised. "Who are you?" "Cop." "Bounty hunter," Rose replied, circling carefully. "Your bail bondsman wants a word." A new voice joined the conversation. "So does the lady you put in the hospital." Bear stood in the doorway, blood seeping from a gash on his arm but very much alive. He held Miller's discarded rifle, pointed at the floor but ready. Miller looked from Rose to Bear, calculating his odds. Whatever he saw in their faces made the fight drain out of him. His shoulders slumped. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he muttered. "It never is," Rose replied, producing zip ties from her pocket. 20 minutes later, Sheriff Taylor's cruiser pulled up outside the cabin, followed by 2 deputies. Miller sat secured in Rose's truck, sullenly staring at nothing. Katie had given her statement, confirming that Miller had shown up at her house 3 days ago, desperate and threatening until she agreed to help him hide. "You took a risk," Taylor said to Rose as the deputies escorted Miller to the cruiser. "Could have gone badly." "Had help," Rose replied, nodding toward Bear, who leaned against his motorcycle nearby, his arm now properly bandaged. Taylor raised an eyebrow. Unlikely partnerships these days. After the sheriff left with Miller and Katie, Rose approached Bear. The silence between them stretched for a moment. "You could have left when things got dangerous," Rose finally said. "Why didn't you?" Bear shrugged, wincing slightly at the movement. "Maybe I wanted to see if the legendary bounty hunter was as good as they say." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Or maybe I've got a problem with men who hit women." "What about our unfinished business?" Rose asked. Bear considered this, then shook his head. "Some scores aren't worth settling." He mounted his motorcycle. "Besides, that zip tie move you pulled on Wrench taught me that one might come in handy someday." Rose allowed herself a small smile. "Safe riding, Bear." "Happy hunting, Cowgirl," he replied, kick-starting the engine. As Bear's motorcycle disappeared down the dirt road, Rose turned to her truck. Frank Peterson would be pleased, both about Miller's capture and saving his money. Beth could finally sleep without fear. And Rose? She had another successful hunt to add to her growing legend. The sun was setting as she drove away from the cabin, painting the sky in colors almost as wild as the day had been. In this line of work, you never knew what, or who, might be waiting around the next corner.